People and cars bustled along the streets of Enugu Old Park. Grace stood at the side of the road, waiting for a break in traffic so she could cross. The cars zipped by, blaring their horns impatiently, the drivers as eager as ever to get wherever they were going, the bus drivers throwing tantrums at passers-by. Grace adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and glanced down at her reflection in a nearby shop window. Her wig, a neat arrangement of long braids, framed her face, the small beads at the ends clicking softly with her movements. It had been a long day at work, and she was eager to get home and unwind. Just as a gap appeared in the traffic, Grace stepped forward, ready to cross. But something made her hesitate. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure staggering toward her from across the street. He moved erratically, his clothes tattered and covered in dirt. His hair was wild, and his skin was caked with grime. It was the madman. She had seen him at that place before. Everyone in the area knew about him. He'd been wandering these streets for as long as anyone could remember. Harmless, they said. He kept to himself, muttering to the air. Living under the bridge near the market, people often tossed him scraps of food, and he would shuffle away, disappearing into the shadows. But today was different. Grace's pulse quickened as the man came closer. She turned her head to step away, but it was too late. In an instant, his hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of her wig. He yanked it hard, pulling her toward him. A scream ripped from Grace's throat as she stumbled, trying to pry herself free from his grip. "Help! Help me!" she cried, panic flooding her voice. The madman's eyes were wild, but they weren't filled with malice. It was as if he was searching for something, something only he could see. Passers-by rushed toward the commotion, surrounding them in a chaotic swirl of noise and confusion. Men and women grabbed the madman, pulling him off Grace, but they didn't strike him. Everyone knew he wasn't violent. No one had ever seen him attack anyone before. "What are you doing?" one of the men shouted, wrenching the madman's hands off Grace. "She's done nothing to you. Do you want to injure her?" The madman let go, retreating with a dazed look in his eyes, his muttering growing louder. Grace collapsed to the ground, clutching her wig, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at him, trembling, but something about his expression caught her attention. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even threatening. In fact, as she looked into his eyes, she saw something else entirely. A flicker of recognition? No, that couldn't be. She didn't know this man. How could she? But the way he looked at her, as if he knew her, sent chills down her spine. All the madmen she knew were violent. Some would always grab what didn't belong to them and run away. "Are you all right?" someone asked, offering her a hand to help her up. Grace nodded slowly, still shaken. As she took the stranger's hand and stood, the crowd began to disperse, the madman wandering off again as if nothing had happened. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Why had he grabbed her? Out of all the people on the street, why her? Her hands trembled as she fixed her wig back onto her head. The beads clicked against each other softly. It reminded her of what had just happened. She glanced back at the madman, who was now a distant figure on the horizon, and a question formed in her mind, one she couldn't ignore. Why did he look at her like that? Did he know her? What surprised Grace more was that she had recently relocated to that city, not for up to 3 months. Later that evening, Grace sat quietly at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The warm steam rose up to her face, but she felt no comfort from it. Her mind was still reeling from the incident that afternoon. The way the madman had grabbed her, the look in his eyes. It had all been too strange. Liliana, her roommate, moved around the kitchen, preparing dinner. The clinking of pots and pans was the only sound that filled the room, apart from the occasional hiss of the boiling stew. Grace had always found the sounds of home comforting, but tonight, they couldn't soothe her unsettled heart. "Grace, you're quiet tonight," Lillian said, glancing at her friend. "Did something happen at work?" Grace hesitated. She hadn't mentioned the madman incident yet, unsure of how to explain what had happened. But as she thought about it more, a growing need to talk overcame her. She couldn't carry this alone, and if there was anyone who might understand, it was her friend or her mother, but she didn't want to call her mother. "Something strange happened today," Grace began, her voice quiet. Lillian stopped stirring the pot and turned to face her friend, her brow furrowed with concern. "What is it?" "I was on my way home from work, and a madman grabbed me." "What?" Lillian rushed to Grace's side, her face pale with worry. "Are you hurt? What did he do to you? Where? Which madman?" "No, no, I'm not hurt," Grace reassured her, shaking her head. "He didn't hurt me. He just grabbed my wig and pulled me toward him. It was like he was trying to, I don't know. It was so strange." "Where did it happen?" Lillian questioned. "At the old park." "That madman at the old park," Grace stated. Lillian sank into the chair across from Grace, her face etched with confusion. "Why would he do that? I heard that he wasn't a violent type." "That's the thing, Lillian. I don't know. But there was something in the way he looked at me. It felt familiar, somehow. Like he knew me, or like I reminded him of someone." "Of who?" Lillian laughed, slapping Grace on the shoulder. "Why would a madman remind you of someone? I think you are suffering from malaria. Please go and take paracetamol." Liliana laughed again. "Lillian, you know that you have a problem. You don't know when someone is being serious," Grace grumbled. "You can't be serious about this one. Meanwhile, the serious ones are in the hospital, dear friend. I heard that that madman had been in that market for God knows when. So forget all that had happened. It was an accident." "I heard you," Grace retorted angrily and left. She sprawled out on the bed. The incident submerged all her thinking. She didn't know what it was, but she was ready to see him again. As she drifted off to sleep, she prayed for God's guidance. The next morning, Grace walked back to the spot where she had encountered the madman. Her heart raced as she searched for him, scanning the street for any sign of the tattered figure she had seen the day before. The sun was bright, and the street was filled with people going about their day, but all she could think about was finding him. After what felt like hours of searching, Grace spotted him sitting under a tree near the market, his back hunched and his head bowed. He looked so small, so fragile, sitting there in the dirt. Taking a deep breath, Grace approached him cautiously. People were staring at her. Some murmured. Grace was afraid, but she let her spirit lead her. She knelt down beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello," she said softly, ready to run. The madman didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the ground, his lips moving in silent muttering. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a small plastic container of food she had brought with her. "I brought you something to eat," she said, holding it out to him. For a long moment, the madman didn't move. But then, slowly, he reached out and took the container from her hands. He opened it and began to eat, his movements slow and deliberate, as though each bite took immense effort. As Grace watched him, her heart ached with the realization of how much this man had suffered. Whether he was someone's father or not, or if he was a human being who had been lost to the world for far too long. Perhaps he was, and his family would be looking for him. She imagined. She didn't say anything more that day. She just sat beside him, watching him eat in silence, her mind racing with questions and emotions she couldn't yet put into words. But one thing was clear. She wasn't going to walk away from him. Not now. Not ever. He was mad, but not violent. The following day, Grace woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. After preparing a small bag of food and a blanket, she set out toward the market again. She didn't know what to expect from her next encounter, but she knew she had to try. The idea of leaving him out there haunted her. The sun was already high in the sky when Grace reached the market. The usual buzz of activity filled the air. Traders calling out their prices, customers bargaining, the scent of fried plant and roasted corn wafting through the air. People tapped on her shoulders, asking her to patronize them, showcasing their dresses and weaving. But Grace's focus was singular. She was looking for the madman. After searching for several minutes, she found him in the same spot as the day before. Sitting under the same tree, his back hunched, his clothes even more tattered than before. He looked so small, so defeated. Taking a deep breath, Grace walked toward him, her steps slow and cautious. She didn't want to startle him. She wondered when the man returned to the tree. As she approached, she could hear the faint sound of his muttering. unintelligible words that seemed to swirl around him like a cloud of confusion. "Hello," Grace said softly, swooping beside him once again. She placed the food and the blanket on the ground in front of him. "I brought you some food. And a blanket." The madman didn't respond at first. His eyes were fixed on something distant, something that only he could see. But after a moment, he glanced down at the food, his hands trembling as he reached for it. Grace watched as he opened the container and began to eat, his movements slow and deliberate. He ate with the same quiet intensity as the day before, as though each bite was a monumental effort. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Grace didn't know what to say, and the madman seemed lost in his own world. But there was something in the way he ate the food she had brought, something almost grateful, as if, somewhere deep inside, he knew she was helping him. She abhorred the look on people's faces, the way they were staring at her. Their expressions were cold, as if the madman wasn't a human being. As the minutes passed, Grace felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It didn't matter what people thought. She wasn't sure what was driving her to come back here, to sit with this man at times after work, instead of going back to her house. But something inside her told her that she was doing the right thing. Something about him called to her, even if she couldn't explain why. When he finished eating, Grace gathered the empty container and the blanket, folding it neatly and placing it beside him. She dipped her hand inside her black handbag, bringing out 1,000 naira. "Take this money," she said, stretching her right hand. "I won't come tomorrow. Use it and buy a nice meal for yourself. I will see you on Monday after work." The madman didn't respond. He simply stared at the ground, his eyes vacant, his mind somewhere far away. But as she stood up to leave, she dropped the money in front. As Grace walked away, she couldn't help but wonder, was she really making a difference? Was this man truly going to be better? Why was she even doing that? Or was she just grasping at a dream? That night, she couldn't stop thinking about the madman. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions. "Grace, what is wrong with you? You haven't been yourself since the day you met that madman," Liliana stated. "Is there anything I need to know?" "Anything like what?" Grace retorted. "I should be asking you. Did the madman charm you on that day?" "Charm me, how?" Grace cut in angrily. "Grace, let's tell ourselves the truth. You have been visiting that man ever since that day? Why? I don't even know how you feel comfortable staying by his side. A friend told me that she saw you with a man under one tree, inside the market. Is it a crime? Have I committed any crime by showing an empathy to the poor man? No. Not a poor man, but a madman. Madman, Grace. Do you know how dangerous it is to be close to him? Like all the awful smell and... Lillian, I know, but I can't help it. I can't even stop myself." "Stop yourself from doing what?" "From visiting him. You see why I said that the madman used a charm on you? Something is definitely wrong." Lillian's hands went across her breast as she began to think. "See, Lily, I don't think the man used anything on me. I just feel attached to him." "So now you are planning on marrying a madman. Like Madman and Grace are getting married. Stop it, Lily. You don't know when someone is serious," Grace barked. "Don't tell me to stop it. This is not a movie or a fairy tale. It is real. You have to stop going there. It is not good for you. I will see what I can do, but I am just trying to see if I can help him get well. Perhaps he needs someone's help." "Is that what he told you?" "No. He had never said a word to me. He ate my food, but never replied to my question. Lily, I think my problem is that I lack father's love. You know I have never seen my father except in pictures. My mom said that he died when I was 1. I wish I knew him. Perhaps all these won't be happening." Grace lamented. "Grace, let's not go into that one today, please. I know your father's soul is resting in peace. Just try and forget about the madman. He is a madman, not your dead father. As a single girl, it is not appropriate to be around him, or don't you know that if he bites you, you will become mad? But he is always calm. He is not going to bite me," Grace said, laughing. "A madman is a madman, and one day he will show you why he is roaming around the street." Grace promised herself that she won't go back to the place again. Lillian was right. It wasn't hygienic at all. It was a dangerous journey. The only thing she wanted was to see if she could take the man to hospital, but it won't happen again. A madman is always a madman. The next few days, Grace returned to the market again. She brought food, water, new clothes, and a blanket. Lillian was perplexed. She told Grace that something was really wrong with her. Grace stopped listening to anyone, and each time she visited, she sat with the madman as he ate in silence, his eyes distant but no longer as wild as they had been on that first day. Slowly, something began to change. The madman started to look at Grace more often, his eyes lingering on her face as if trying to place her. His muttering grew quieter, less frantic, and there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when he seemed almost lucid. One afternoon, as Grace sat beside him, the madman looked directly at her for the first time. His eyes were clearer than she had ever seen them. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes was enough. It was as if he was trying to say something, trying to communicate in a way that words couldn't express. "Do you remember me?" Grace asked softly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Do you know who I am?" The madman didn't respond, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, just like before. It was faint, but it was there. "I'm Grace," she said, her voice trembling, "the lady you grabbed her wig the other day." For a moment, the madman's expression changed. His eyes widened ever so slightly, and his lips parted as if he was about to speak. But then, just as quickly, the moment passed, and his gaze fell back to the ground. Grace's heart sank. She had been so close to reaching him, but something inside him was still locked away, something she couldn't break through. How could she ask him anything when he didn't say a word to her? Lillian had advised her to take the man out from the market, to shave his hair, but that wouldn't be possible unless he talks. Grace stared at him, trying to gather her next question. She was about to open her mouth when the man disappeared into the market. Grace stood dejected. Perhaps she was also mad. The days turned into weeks, and Grace's visits became part of her routine. Every day, she sat with the madman, bringing him food, water, and clothes. The community began to notice her acts of kindness, and while some people mocked her for wasting her time on a madman, others admired her dedication. Eventually, Grace decided it was time to take things a step further. The madman needed medical attention, real care. If she was going to help him, she couldn't do it alone. She needed the help of professionals. Lillian supported her. Lillian had started following Grace to the market, though she never got close to the madman. "Prevention is better than cure," Lillian told Grace. But all Grace wanted from her was just her encouragement and her support, someone to tell her that she wasn't insane, that she was doing the right thing. Grace approached a local doctor who had a small clinic near the market. She explained the situation, and the doctor agreed to help. Together, they arranged for the madman to be brought to the clinic, where he would receive a full assessment and treatment. The day they brought the madman to the clinic was both terrifying and hopeful. Grace had no idea what the doctors would find or whether they would be able to help him, but she knew she had to try. She couldn't give up on him. Not now. Lillian was at her back, giving her hopes. Her labor wouldn't be in vain. As the doctors began their evaluation, Grace and Lillian sat in the waiting room, Grace's heart pounding with anticipation. Would they be able to help him? Would he finally get the care he needed? And most importantly, would he still remember where he came from? Grace's heart raced as she sat in the small clinic waiting room, her fingers nervously tapping on the arm of the plastic chair. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, and the low hum of the ceiling fan did little to calm her frayed nerves. The doctor had been with the madman for nearly an hour, conducting various tests and evaluations. Grace's mind was a storm of questions and fears. What if they couldn't help him? What if she had been holding on to false hope all along? Lillian sat beside her, quiet and still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't said much since they arrived at the clinic, but the tension on Grace's face made her unease. "Grace, calm yourself down. The doctors are doing their work. I just pray that the man gets well. Let it be the only thing I achieve in this world." As they were talking, they heard sounds at their back and Grace spun around. Finally, the door to the doctor's office creaked open, and Dr. Bassi, the man overseeing the madman's case, stepped out. His expression was neutral, giving nothing away. But Grace could feel the weight of whatever news he was about to deliver. "Miss Grace, Mississippi Lillian," Dr. Bassi said, nodding at them both. "Please come inside." Grace's legs felt weak as she stood, but she followed the doctor into the small, sterile office. Lillian walked along. The madman sat on a bed in the corner of the room, his eyes vacant once again, his hands folded in his lap. He looked almost smaller in the bright clinical light, his frailty more pronounced than ever. The sight tugged at Grace's heart. "Thank you for coming," Dr. Bassi said as they sat down across from him. "We've run several tests, and I've had a chance to speak with him, though his responses were limited." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Did you find anything?" Dr. Bassi nodded slowly. "First, I want to commend you for bringing him in. He's severely malnourished and has been living in extremely poor conditions for a long time. Physically, he's very weak, but we're addressing that now. With proper care, his body will heal." Lillian smiled and clapped Grace at her laps. "But what about his mind?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. Can he recover?" The doctor sighed, glancing at the madman, who remained silent and unresponsive. "It's difficult to say. He's been living with untreated schizophrenia for what appears to be many years. The symptoms are severe: disorganized thinking, delusions, and possibly hallucinations. This would explain why he's been wandering the streets for so long, disconnected from reality. Without treatment, his condition deteriorated, and he lost touch with the world around him." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. "Is there any chance he can come back? Mentally, I mean? With the right medication and therapy, there's a possibility we can manage his symptoms and help him regain some clarity," Dr. Bassi explained gently. "But it's important to understand that his recovery won't be quick or easy. It will take time, and even then, he may never fully return to the person he once was." Grace glanced at Lillian, whose face was pale and drawn, her eyes glistening with emotions. "And what about his identity? Is there any way to know for sure who he is? Where did he come from?" Dr. Bassi shifted in his seat. "We haven't been able to get a clear answer from him about his past. His responses to questions about his name or history are either confused or incoherent. You will have to give us more time." Grace nodded her head in agreement. The next few weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and medication adjustments. The madman had been transferred to another clinic, where he began receiving the treatment he so desperately needed. It was a slow process, but with each passing day, Grace saw small signs of improvement. His eyes became a little clearer, his speech a little less disjointed. There were moments, fleeting but precious, where he seemed to recognize her each time she visited. One afternoon, as Grace sat beside him in the clinic, reading her book, the madman lifted his hand and touched her face. He stared into her eyes. For the first time since she had found him, the madman looked directly at her, his eyes clear and focused, his lips parted, and in a voice that was weak, he spoke. "Grace, I heard the doctor called you that." Grace's heart stopped. She stared at him in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. Yes, that's my name?" Tears of joy trickled down from Grace's eyes. She was filled with emotions. Even if the man didn't recover fully, she would always be happy that she had offered her help in a little way. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Why are you helping me, a madman?" Tears streamed down Grace's face as she clutched his hand tighter, her heart swelling with hope. "You are no longer a madman. You are now fine. I am helping you because you deserve better. I'm here. I've always been here. My God will surely pay you for all you did for me." Grace coughed, trying to know how to place her next question. "Do you remember anything now? Like where you come from? Your family?" The madman, still frail and distant, didn't say anything more. His brief moment of clarity seemed to slip away as quickly as it had come. Weeks turned into months, and the madman's recovery, though slow, continued. The doctors were able to manage his schizophrenia with medication, and while he still had moments of confusion and disorientation, there were also moments of clarity. During these moments, the madman was almost himself again. One evening, as Grace sat with him in the clinic, The madman spoke again, this time in more than just a fleeting moment of lucidity. "I remember. The bridge," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace leaned closer, her heart racing. "The bridge?" The madman nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I was running. I didn't know where I was going. My mind, it was broken. But I remember the bridge. I slept there for years. Then one day a terrible accident happened." Grace's throat tightened as she listened. He was recalling the time when he had been lost, when he had wandered the streets, alone and abandoned. The bridge he spoke of was likely one of the many overpasses in the city where homeless people often took shelter. "What happened after that?" Grace asked gently, not wanting to push him too hard. The madman closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to pull the memories from the fog of his mind. "I don't remember much. Everything was dark. But I remember the accident killed many people. That was why I left the place." Grace's heart swelled with emotion. "Do you remember any of your family members? Were you married before?" Grace probed. The madman shook his head. He couldn't remember anything else. For a long time, they sat together in silence, the weight of his past hanging heavy between them. But there was also something else, something new. A sense of hope, a sense that he would soon be fine. The madman's moments of clarity continued to grow more frequent, though they were still interspersed with periods of confusion. The doctors warned Grace that his recovery would never be complete. His mind had been fractured too deeply by years of untreated mental illness. But with medication and care, they could help him maintain a level of stability that would allow him to live a more peaceful life. One afternoon, after a particularly long therapy session, the madman asked Grace a question that took her by surprise. "Can I go home?" Grace blinked, unsure of how to respond. Where would he go? He knew nothing about his past? She reasoned. "I don't know," she said cautiously. "The doctors think it's better if you stay here for now. They want to make sure you're fully stable before you leave." Grace said, still in deep thought. The madman nodded slowly, but Grace could see the disappointment in his expression. "I understand, but I want to go home. You haven't even told me anything about your home. Where are you from? If I go out there, I might see people that know me." His words weren't just words. Grace's chest tightened at his words. "I'll talk to the doctors," she promised, her voice soft. "We'll see what we can do." Later that evening, Grace spoke with Dr. Kelvin about the possibility of the madman returning home. The doctor was hesitant at first, explaining that while the madman had made great progress, he was still fragile. Living outside of the controlled environment of the clinic could be overwhelming for him, especially given the chaotic nature of the city. "But if he's stable enough," Grace argued, "couldn't we give it a try? He's asking to go home. He wants to be with his family." Dr. Kelvin considered her words carefully before nodding. "We can arrange for him to have supervised visits at home. But he'll need to continue his treatment, and we'll have to monitor his progress closely. If he shows any signs of regression, he'll need to return to the clinic immediately." Grace agreed, relieved that they were at least willing to try. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a step in the right direction. A chance for the madman to experience some semblance of normalcy after all these years. She was about to step out when the doctor called her name. "Miss Grace, do you know his family? Where did he come from?" Grace came back to the doctor. He hadn't remembered anything except what happened under the bridge many years ago. "Then I guess you should leave him here. Let's examine him for some time." Grace went back and told the madman that the doctor had agreed to let him go, but that would be at the end of the month. The doctor wanted to make sure he was in the best state before leaving. For a moment, the madman's eyes softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It was fleeting, gone in an instant. Grace threw her handbag over to the table and jumped into the bed. It had been a hectic day, and all she wanted at that moment was a good sleep. As she was about to close her eyes, she heard her cell phone ringing. Who is this now? She grumbled angrily. Sluggishly, she went for her bag and brought the phone out. Instantly, the sleep that had overwhelmed her a few minutes ago vanished. It was her mother on the line. "Grace, what's the meaning of this nonsense? How could you leave your mother under the sun for how many hours? I have been calling you since morning." "Mama, Please forgive me. I have been busy the whole day, Grace pleaded. Busy doing what? Since when did bankers start working on Saturdays, Grace? Mama, it is not that one, there's… I don't need your explanation. Come here and take me out. Okay, Mama. Which side are you now? I am at the Holy Ghost. I am sitting inside the Eastern Mass Terminal. Grace's mother, after taking her food and having her bath, now sat on the chair with Grace and Lillian. While they were talking, she said, Grace, what is it that you wanted to tell me that time? Mama, I have been in the hospital the whole day. Hospital? Are you sick? Why didn't you tell me? Did you tell your brothers? Grace's mother asked. Mama, I am not sick. Grace interrupted her mother. So why did you go to hospital? Is the hospital now your place of work? Grace's mother questioned angrily. Grace explained everything that happened between her and the madman. She narrated it from the day the man dragged her wig. Her mother listened intently. You have done well, my daughter. Perhaps if someone had given your father such help, he would have been here with us. Grace's mother said sorrowfully. What do you mean, Mama? Grace probed. For a long moment, Grace's mother was silent, her eyes distant as if she was searching through the past for an answer. Grace could see the gears turning in her mother's mind, and then, finally, her mother spoke in a low, thoughtful voice. You said you met him at the old park? Grace nodded slowly. Yes, I've seen him around before. Everyone knows about him. He's been living on the streets for years. But on that day, when he grabbed me, there was something different. It felt like he was trying to tell me something, but he couldn't. Grace's mother's face grew more serious as she leaned forward, her eyes locked on her daughter. Grace, there's something I need to tell you. Something I never thought I'd have to talk about again. Grace adjusted a little, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. What is it, Mama? Her mother took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them across her breast. You know about your father. How he disappeared 20 years ago. Yes, Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father had always been a shadow in her life. She knew him through old pictures, but his absence had shaped her family in ways she couldn't fully understand. What I didn't tell you is that before your father disappeared, he wasn't well, her mother continued. He was struggling, mentally. First, it was small things. He would forget conversations, or he'd get confused about where he was. But as time went on, it got worse. He started hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. Grace listened intently, her mind racing as pieces of her family's history began to fall into place. He became more and more distant, her mother said, her voice heavy with the weight of old memories. And then, one day, he just left. No explanation, no goodbye. He just walked out the door and never came back. We searched for him for months, years, but no one knew where he had gone. Eventually, we heard from someone that a man matching his description had been hit by a car and killed, along with some other people under the bridge. We assumed it was him, even though we never saw the body. I had to accept it, Grace. We did his burial. Mama, why haven't you or my brothers told me these things? Grace sprang up. Am I not his daughter? Why did you people have to conceal something like this from me? I am the one that is responsible, not your brothers. I took them under oath never to tell you this. You are my only daughter, and I didn't want anything to make you feel inferior. Her mother said, How could I feel inferior because of my father's condition? He was my father, and that's all that matters. Lillian begged Grace to sit down. You see why I said that I wish someone gave Emma, your father, the kind of care you have been giving to the madman. Perhaps he would have been here with us. They took him away from me when I needed him most. But well, God knows the best. He will judge the wicked ones. Grace's mother started weeping. Mama, it is okay. Please stop crying. Grace and Lillian said in unison. When are you going to see the madman again? Grace's mother asked. Do you want to see him? Grace asked, and her mother nodded, her face etched with pain. The next morning, Grace spoke to her mother again. This time, to know if she really wants to see the madman. Grace, your gestures towards the madman reminded me of your father, Emma. He loved helping people, looking after others. Grace nodded. feeling the weight of her mother's words settle on her shoulders. She was determined now, more determined than ever. She couldn't walk away from this. She had to see it through. That she resembled her father was another big motivation. Grace, Lillian and Grace's mother took Kiki Drop to the hospital. Grace's mother bought a bunch of bananas, groundnuts and apples. In Grace's left hand was a food flask. She had made the food special for the madman. As they were about to step into the hospital, they met the doctor. The doctor smiled at them. "Miss Grace, Miss Lillian, you people are welcome." He then turned to Grace. "Miss Grace, please meet me in my office." Grace followed the doctor to his office while Lillian took Grace's mother to the madman. The madam was facing the wall when they entered. Lillian coughed and greeted. But as the man turned his face, Grace's mother let out a loud scream and collapsed on the hospital floor. The madman stared at them perplexed. He knew Lillian, but not the woman on the floor. Lillian rushed outside immediately to fetch the doctor. Grace, the doctor and nurses emerged and took Grace's mother outside. Lillian couldn't explain what happened. Everything seemed like a movie. All she knew was that the woman collapsed the moment she saw the madman's face. Now, Grace sat close to her mother, massaging her palms. The doctor assured her that her mother would be fine, but she wanted to know why she collapsed. Finally, the woman opened her eyes. "I saw Emma." "Emma is the madman?" It sounded somehow. Grace couldn't believe what she had heard. If the madman was Emma, that means he was her father, Grace reasoned. "Take me back to him. I want to see him. I want to make sure I know who I saw in that hospital bed." With uttermost confusion, Grace and Lillian took Grace's mother back to the room. Grace's mother stood at the doorway, and with a gentle voice she said, "Emma, Emma, is that you?" The madman turned immediately. He heard the voice and the name. He remembered the voice. He knew the voice. "Victoria, is that you?" Grace and Lillian froze. They stared agape, dumbfounded. Grace's heart pounded in her chest, emotions swirling within her. It was him, the madman. The man who had been wandering the streets, lost and forgotten, was her father. She had found him. After all these years, he had survived. Tears filled Grace's eyes as she looked at the man who had once been her father. He didn't look like the man in the photo anymore. His hair was wild and gray, his face weathered and hollow. Grace's mother moved closer and hugged him tight. "Victoria, what are you doing here? How did she find you? Who directed her to you?" The madman asked. "Who? You mean Grace?" Grace's mother chuckled. "Grace is my daughter, your daughter, Emma." Everyone in the hospital at that moment felt like they were watching movies or listening to stories. How could one believe that something like that was real? That the madman you have been looking after was your real father? Unbelievable. Grace stepped closer to him, her heart aching with both joy and sorrow. Now not just as someone who was helping a madman, but as someone who had seen her father ever since she was born. "Papa," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "Papa." She reached out and gently took his hand, holding it tightly in her own. "I found you," she whispered through her tears. "I knew that there was something, a kind of connection between us. Thank God I found you." The day Emma returned home for the first time was one of the most emotional days of Grace's life. She had spent the entire morning cleaning the house, making sure everything was in order, while her mother prepared her father's favorite meals from before he had disappeared. Lillian was there with her friend. Grace's 3 brothers came back. They had seen him and they all recognized him at the first sight. When the car pulled up in front of the house, Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She stood at the door, watching as her brothers helped her father out of the car and walked him toward the house. He looked frail, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. As he stepped through the door, Emma paused, looking around the house as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the walls, the furniture, the small mementos of a life he had once known. "I'm home," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Grace rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Papa, you're home.